Marcus thought it was just another drive home, until a cop targeted him for his race. Could he stand against this injustice? His hidden strength would leave everyone in the courtroom speechless. The highway stretched endlessly before Marcus Carter, a 35-year-old black man, as he drove through the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, on a rain-soaked evening in 2022. The night was heavy with the scent of wet asphalt, the kind of damp chill that seeped through the cracks of his old sedan and settled into his bones. Streetlights flickered above, their pale glow casting jagged shadows that danced across the pavement, while the soft, soulful notes of an old R&B tune, Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," drifted from the speakers, filling the car with a bittersweet warmth. Marcus adjusted his rearview mirror, his broad shoulders easing back into the worn leather seat, his hands steady on the wheel. He wore a simple navy jacket, the collar slightly frayed, and a pair of faded jeans, the kind of outfit that spoke of a man who worked hard and kept his head down. His dark eyes, sharp and observant, flicked to the dashboard clock. Just past 10 p.m. It had been a long day at the base, filled with paperwork and training drills, and all he wanted was to get home, pour a glass of bourbon, and let the weight of the day slip away. The highway was nearly deserted, save for the occasional car that rolled past, their headlights slicing through the darkness like fleeting ghosts. Marcus's mind wandered to his younger brother, Jamal, who'd called earlier that day, his voice bright with excitement about a new job offer. Marcus had smiled through the phone, proud of the kid who'd once followed him around their old neighborhood, asking endless questions about the Army. That memory brought a faint smile to Marcus's lips, but it faded quickly as a sudden flash of red and blue lights erupted in his rearview mirror, sharp and unyielding, like a predator's eyes locking onto its prey. His stomach twisted, not from fear, but from a deep, bitter familiarity that settled like a stone in his chest. He'd been here before, not just in his own life but in the stories he'd heard growing up, the warnings his father had drilled into him as a teenager. Keep your hands where they can see 'em, son. Don't give 'em a reason. Marcus exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the cold window, and signaled to pull over, easing his car onto the narrow shoulder of the highway. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he came to a stop, the engine's hum fading into a tense silence. He placed both hands on the wheel, fingers gripping the leather tightly, every movement deliberate, every second stretching into an eternity as he waited for what he knew was coming. A white patrol car pulled up just behind him, its lights still flashing, staining the night with their relentless glow. The officer took his time getting out, the door creaking open with a slow, deliberate groan, as if he enjoyed drawing out the moment. When he finally stepped into view, Marcus caught his reflection in the side mirror. A white man with a buzz cut, his face hard and unyielding, his stride cocky, like a man who knew he held all the power. The name on his badge glinted in the dim light: Officer Greg Daniels. Daniels approached the driver's side window, his heavy boots scuffing against the wet asphalt, one hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun, the other clutching a flashlight that he flicked on with a sharp click. The beam cut through the darkness, blinding Marcus for a moment as it swept across his face, lingering there like a spotlight on a stage. "License and registration," Daniels barked, his voice flat and cold, devoid of any warmth or courtesy, the kind of tone that carried an unspoken challenge. Marcus kept his movements slow and measured, reaching into the glove compartment with one hand while keeping the other visible on the wheel, his heart pounding steadily despite the calm he projected. He pulled out the documents, a small stack of papers that felt heavier than they should have, and handed them over through the cracked window, the rain slipping in and dotting his sleeve with tiny beads of water. "Was I speeding, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, though he could feel the tension coiling tighter in his chest, a spring ready to snap. Daniels didn't answer right away, his eyes narrowing as he took the papers, holding them just out of Marcus's reach as if testing him. He gave Marcus a long, hard look, his gaze raking over him with a mix of suspicion and disdain, taking in the jacket, the jeans, the car, a modest sedan that had seen better days. "Taillights out," Daniels finally said, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, a smirk that said he knew he could say anything and Marcus would have to take it. Marcus's brow furrowed, his mind racing. That couldn't be right. His tail lights had been checked just last week during a routine maintenance at the base, part of the strict protocols he followed as a major in the U.S. Army. He knew better than to let something like that slide, not when he'd seen how the smallest excuse could be weaponized against someone who looked like him. "I don't think that's right," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm, each word carefully chosen, a quiet defiance that he knew could either diffuse the situation or set it ablaze. Daniel's smirk widened, a flicker of something dangerous crossing his face. Amusement, maybe, or irritation at being questioned. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his tone sharpening, the words slicing through the night like a blade. A lone car slowed as it passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene before dimming again. The driver, a young woman named Tara, peered out through her rain-streaked window, her hazel eyes wide with concern as she took in the flashing lights, the officer's aggressive stance, the man sitting so still in his car. Tara's grip tightened on her steering wheel, her heart thudding with a mix of fear and anger. She'd seen scenes like this play out too many times in her own life, and something told her this wasn't right. Daniel's smirk vanished in an instant, his eyes narrowing into slits as a flush of irritation crept up his neck. "You think you can talk back to me, huh?" he hissed, stepping closer to the car, his hand tightening on his belt, the leather creaking under his grip, his voice low and laced with menace, each word dripping with the weight of unchecked authority. Out of the car, now. Marcus felt the air shift, a cold electric tension that crackled between them, the kind he'd felt before in countless moments of his life, in the stories his mother had told him as a child, her voice trembling as she recounted her own encounters with men like Daniel's, in the army barracks, where he'd seen authority misused by officers who thought their rank made them untouchable. In the quiet moments of reflection after a long day, when he wondered if things would ever change. He knew this game, knew the unspoken rules: comply, survive, fight later. But he also knew his rights, knew the lines Daniels was already crossing, and that knowledge burned in his chest like a quiet fire, steady and unyielding. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt with deliberate slowness, the click of the metal echoing in the silence of the car, the rain outside falling harder now, a steady drumbeat against the roof. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped onto the pavement, the cold biting at his skin through his jacket, his boots steady against the slick ground despite the tremor of adrenaline that coursed through him. The rain soaked into his clothes, tiny rivulets running down his neck. But he stood tall, his posture relaxed but measured, a soldier's stance even in civilian clothes. Daniels jabbed a finger toward the car, his movements sharp and aggressive, his voice rising over the sound of the rain. "Turn around! Hands on the car!" Marcus paused, his dark eyes locking onto Daniels, searching for a crack in the man's facade, a hint of reason he could appeal to. "For what reason?" he asked, his voice unwavering, steady as a drumbeat, each word a quiet challenge that hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Daniel's face darkened, a flush of anger spreading across his features, his jaw clenching so tightly Marcus could see the muscle twitch. He snapped his hand to his radio, his movements jerky, fueled by a rage he didn't bother to hide. "Got a non-compliant driver here," he barked into the speaker, his voice loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, a performance for an audience that wasn't there. Or so he thought. Then, louder, his eyes boring into Marcus, he shouted, "You're under arrest for obstruction!" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. But he didn't flinch, didn't let the fear show, even as his mind raced, calculating his next move, weighing the risks of pushing back against the certainty of what would come if he didn't. He'd seen this play out too many times, heard the stories from friends, from family, from soldiers under his command. Black men and women targeted, humiliated, sometimes worse, all because someone with a badge decided they didn't belong. Tara, the woman in the passing car, had pulled over a safe distance away, her small hatchback idling on the shoulder, the rain streaking down her windshield in heavy sheets. She was 28, a nurse who'd grown up in a diverse neighborhood on the east side of Columbus, where she'd seen her older brother stopped and searched for no reason more times than she could count. Those memories flooded back now, a bitter taste in her mouth as she watched the scene unfold through her rain-blurred window. She couldn't just drive away, couldn't let this happen without someone bearing witness. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone, the screen glowing softly in the darkness of her car, and hit record, the tiny red dot a silent promise that this wouldn't go unnoticed. She zoomed in, capturing Daniel's aggressive posture, the way he towered over Marcus, the man's calm defiance in the face of it all. Tara's heart pounded, but her resolve hardened. She'd seen too much injustice in her life, and if she could do something, even something small, she would. Daniels grabbed Marcus's arms without warning, yanking them back with a force that made Marcus wince, the cold metal of the cuffs snapping shut around his wrists, biting into his skin far too tightly. Marcus felt the sharp sting, the pressure cutting off circulation, but he didn't react, didn't give Daniels the satisfaction of seeing him break. As Daniels shoved him toward the patrol car, Marcus caught a glimpse of Tara's car in the distance, the faint glow of her phone's screen through the rain, a tiny light in the stormy night that sparked a flicker of hope in his chest. He wasn't as alone as he'd thought, and that knowledge steadied him, even as Daniels slammed the door of the patrol car shut, sealing him in with a heavy thud that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet night. Marcus sat on the cold metal bench, the chill seeping through his jeans, his wrists throbbing where the cuffs had bitten into his skin, leaving red welts that pulsed with every heartbeat. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds, casting a harsh glow that made the stark white walls of the holding cell feel even more oppressive. He leaned back, his head resting against the concrete, his broad shoulders tensing as he forced himself to breathe slowly, in and out, a rhythm he'd learned in the army to keep his mind sharp under pressure. His thoughts drifted to his last deployment, a dusty outpost in Afghanistan where he'd faced down threats far greater than this, a roadside bomb, a sniper's scope glinting in the distance. But this felt different, more insidious, because this wasn't a battlefield halfway across the world. This was home, and the enemy wore a badge. Daniel's words echoed in his mind, that sneering taunt, "should have kept your mouth shut," and Marcus' chest burned with a quiet, simmering anger, the kind that didn't explode but smoldered, fueling his resolve. He wouldn't let this break him, wouldn't give Daniels the satisfaction of seeing him crumble, not after everything he'd been through. Not after the years he'd spent proving himself in a world that often refused to see him as anything more than a stereotype. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy and deliberate, the kind that carried an arrogance Marcus could feel even before the man came into view. Daniels appeared outside the cell, his buzz cut catching the light, his smirk as sharp as a blade, his eyes glinting with a cruel satisfaction that made Marcus's stomach churn. He tapped the bars with his knuckles, the sound a sharp metallic clink that reverberated through the small space, a taunting rhythm meant to unnerve. "Shoulda kept your mouth shut," Daniels sneered, his voice dripping with disdain, his lips curling as he leaned closer to the bars, close enough that Marcus could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed with a smug certainty. "You think you're tough, huh? Sitting there all quiet like you're better than me? I've seen guys like you, always thinking you can play the victim, always thinking the rules don't apply." Marcus didn't respond, didn't move, his face a mask of calm that belied the storm raging inside him. He'd learned long ago that men like Daniels fed on reactions, on fear, on anger, and Marcus refused to give him anything to feast on. But the words stung, each one a barb that dug into the wounds of a lifetime spent navigating a world where his skin color made him a target, where his uniform, his major's insignia, his commendations meant nothing to someone who saw only a threat. Daniels chuckled, a low, mocking sound that grated on Marcus's nerves, and turned to walk away, his boot scuffing against the linoleum floor, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the wall. Marcus watched him go, his hands clenching into fists, his nails digging into his palms, the pain a grounding force that kept him tethered to the moment. He thought of Tara, the woman who'd filmed the arrest, her small act of defiance a lifeline he clung to in the darkness of this cell. He didn't know her, didn't even know her name yet, but the memory of her phone's glowing screen through the rain gave him a flicker of hope, a reminder that there were people out there who cared, who wouldn't let this go unnoticed. That thought steadied him, eased the anger that threatened to consume him, and he closed his eyes for a moment, picturing his brother Jamal's face, the way he'd looked up to Marcus as a kid, always asking about the army, always wanting to be just like him. Marcus had to get through this, had to make it back to Jamal, to show him that the world could be unjust but it could also be fought, that resilience wasn't just a word, but a way of life. More footsteps, lighter this time, less sure, broke through his thoughts. Marcus opened his eyes, his gaze sharpening as a younger officer approached the cell, a clipboard tucked under his arm, his uniform crisp but his posture hesitant, like he wasn't sure he should be here. Officer Lopez, a Latino man in his early 20s, stopped a few feet from the bars, his dark eyes flicking nervously toward the hallway where Daniels had disappeared. Lopez was new to the force, barely a year in, driven by a naive hope to make a difference, to be the kind of cop his community could trust. But he'd seen Daniels' patterns. Too many arrests of black drivers, too many excuses that didn't add up, too many nights where he'd gone home feeling like he was part of the problem instead of the solution. He glanced at Marcus, taking in the man's calm demeanor, the way he sat with a quiet dignity that Daniels had tried to strip away, and something in Lopez's chest tightened, a mix of guilt and admiration. "This doesn't sit right with me," Lopez said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if he were afraid someone might overhear. Marcus studied him, his sharp eyes catching the flicker of unease in Lopez's expression, the way his fingers tightened around the clipboard, the slight tremor in his hand. There was something familiar about the young officer, a memory that tugged at the edges of Marcus's mind, and then it clicked. Lopez, the kid from the community outreach program at a local high school a few years back, where Marcus had spoken about resilience, about overcoming the odds. Lopez had been in the audience, a skinny teenager with a notebook, scribbling down every word Marcus said, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and determination. Marcus's expression softened slightly, a faint spark of recognition lighting his gaze, but he didn't say anything, not yet, waiting to see what Lopez would do. Lopez hesitated, then stepped closer to the bars, his voice dropping even lower. "That woman who filmed you? She's already called a lawyer," he said, slipping a small folded note through the bars, his movements quick and furtive, his eyes darting back to the hallway. Marcus took the note, his fingers brushing against the rough paper, and unfolded it, the words written in a hasty scrawl. "Help is coming. Hold on." A wave of relief washed over him, mingling with the anger that still burned in his chest, and he looked up at Lopez, his voice steady but thick with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying a weight that Lopez felt in his bones, a weight that made him stand a little taller, even as he nodded and turned away, his footsteps fading down the hall. The Columbus courthouse buzzed with tension, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and the murmur of voices as spectators packed the wooden benches, their whispers a low hum that filled the room like a swarm of bees. Marcus stood beside his attorney, James Carter, a sharp black man in a tailored gray suit, his movements precise as he organized a stack of papers on the table, his dark eyes flicking to Marcus with a quiet confidence that steadied him. James had a reputation for taking on cases like this, cases where the system had failed, where men like Daniels thought they could bend the law to their will, and he'd been working through the night to build a case that would dismantle Daniels's lies piece by piece. Across the room, Officer Daniels sat at the prosecution's table, his posture stiff, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his buzz cut catching the light from the overhead chandelier. The smugness that had defined him on the highway was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that radiated from him like heat, his eyes darting to the judge's bench, to the jury, to the gallery, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. Judge Clara Evans entered the room, her black robe swishing softly as she settled into her seat, her white hair pulled back in a tight bun, her no-nonsense demeanor silencing the crowd with a single sharp rap of her gavel. "Let's get started," she said, her voice firm, her eyes scanning the room with a piercing intensity that made even the most seasoned attorneys sit up straighter. James stepped forward, his voice clear and commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor, we have evidence that proves my client, Marcus Carter, was wrongfully arrested," he said, holding up a USB drive, its black casing glinting in the light. He moved to the courtroom's projector, inserting the drive with a steady hand, and Tara's video began to play on a large screen at the front of the room. The footage was grainy, the rain streaking across the lens, but it was clear enough. Daniel's aggressive tone, his barked orders, The way he'd yanked Marcus' arms back, the unnecessary force of the arrest, Marcus' calm compliance in the face of it all. The gallery murmured, a wave of unease rippling through the crowd. A juror, a middle-aged black woman with a tight braid, shaking her head in disbelief, her lips pressing into a thin line as she watched the scene unfold. Daniel's face flushed a deep red, his hands clenching into fists on the table, his defense crumbling with every second of the video, every frame a nail in the coffin of his career. James paused the footage, turning to the judge, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "This arrest was baseless, Your Honor. Officer Daniels acted on bias, not evidence, and we have the records to prove a pattern of misconduct." Daniels shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting to his attorney, a wiry man in a cheap suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The attorney stood, clearing his throat, his voice shaky as he tried to salvage the situation. "Your Honor, the officer was following procedure. Mr. Carter was non-compliant," he said. But the words sounded hollow, unconvincing, even to his own ears. Judge Evans raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass, and turned to Marcus, her voice measured but expectant. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything to add?" Marcus took a deep breath, his broad shoulders squaring as he stepped forward, his presence commanding the room, every eye on him, every whisper silenced. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, resonating with a quiet power that filled the space, "I'm Major Marcus Carter, U.S. Army, and I studied law during my service." The room erupted in a wave of gasps, the gallery buzzing with shock, the jurors leaning forward in their seats, their eyes wide as they processed the revelation. Marcus continued, his voice unwavering, each word a hammer striking at the foundation of Daniel's case. "I was mentored by a renowned civil rights lawyer during my military career, a man who taught me how to fight for justice, how to stand up to systems that thrive on bias. This arrest was baseless, built on nothing but prejudice, not evidence. I've served my country, led soldiers in combat, earned commendations for my leadership, and yet Officer Daniels saw none of that. He saw only the color of my skin, and he thought that gave him the right to strip me of my dignity." Daniel's face went pale, his hands trembling on the table, the reality of his mistake crashing down around him like a tidal wave. Marcus's words hung in the air, heavy with truth, and the gallery fell silent, the weight of his revelation settling over the room like a storm cloud ready to burst. Tara, seated in the back of the gallery, couldn't hold back any longer. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor, her voice trembling with emotion as she shouted, "I saw it all! He did nothing wrong!" Her words echoed through the room, a raw, unfiltered cry for justice that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine, a reminder of the small act of courage that had brought him to this moment. The gallery erupted again, whispers turning to murmurs, murmurs to shouts, as the crowd's anger at Daniel's actions boiled over, their voices a chorus of support for Marcus, a man they'd never met but whose story they now felt in their bones. Judge Evans banged her gavel, her voice rising over the noise. "Order!" she snapped, but her eyes softened as they landed on Marcus, a flicker of respect in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the strength it took to stand here, to fight back, to win. Judge Evans' gavel came down with a sharp crack, the sound reverberating through the courtroom like a thunderclap, silencing the murmurs that had erupted after Tara's outburst. "Charges dismissed," she declared, her voice firm, cutting through the tension with the precision of a blade, her white hair catching the light as she leaned forward, her piercing gaze fixed on Officer Daniels. "Officer Daniels, you're under investigation for misconduct, and I'll be recommending a full review of your arrest history to the district attorney's office." Daniel's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks as if someone had pulled a plug, his hands trembling on the table, his buzz cut no longer a symbol of authority but a stark contrast to the vulnerability that now defined him. His eyes darted to the gallery, to the jurors, to his attorney, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there, his career unraveling before his eyes like a thread pulled from a sweater, each tug revealing more of the mess beneath. The gallery erupted in whispers, some spectators clapping softly, their hands coming together in a quiet rhythm that spoke of relief, of justice, of a moment they'd waited too long to see. Marcus exhaled slowly, the breath he'd been holding escaping in a rush, the weight that had pressed on his shoulders since that rainy night on the highway lifting, leaving behind a lightness he hadn't felt in days. Daniel slumped back in his chair, his hands dropping to his lap, his jaw tight as he stared at the table, unable to meet the eyes of the room, unable to face the reality of what he'd done. His attorney, the wiry man in the cheap suit, whispered something in his ear, but Daniels didn't respond, his mind racing, replaying every decision that had led him to this moment. The late-night stop, the smirk he'd worn like armor, the cuffs he'd snapped on too tightly, the taunts he'd thrown at Marcus in the holding cell. He'd thought he was untouchable, thought his badge gave him the right to wield power however he saw fit. But now that power was gone, stripped away by a man he'd underestimated, a man who'd turned his own arrogance against him. The jurors filed out, their faces a mix of emotions, some satisfied, some angry. The middle-aged black woman with the tight braid casting a final glance at Marcus, her eyes shining with a quiet pride, a silent acknowledgement of the victory he'd won, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been in his shoes. Marcus turned to James, his attorney, his broad shoulders relaxing as he extended a hand, his grip firm, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying a weight that James felt in his chest, a weight that reminded him why he'd chosen this path, why he fought for men like Marcus every day. James nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips, his dark eyes warm with respect. "You did the hard part," he replied, his voice low, his hand lingering in Marcus's for a moment longer, a silent promise that this wouldn't be the end, that they'd keep fighting, keep pushing for change. The courtroom began to clear, spectators filing out into the hallway, their voices rising in a cacophony of chatter, some pulling out phones to record the moment, others whispering about the video, about Marcus, about the major who'd turned the tables on a system that had tried to break him. Officer Lopez approached as the crowd thinned, his uniform crisp but his posture softer now, his dark eyes filled with a mix of guilt and admiration as he stopped in front of Marcus. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said, his voice thick with respect, his hand extending in a gesture of solidarity, his fingers trembling slightly as Marcus took it, their handshake firm, a bridge built between two men who'd seen the same system from different sides. Lopez's mind flashed back to that high school auditorium, to the day Marcus had spoken about resilience, about standing tall in the face of adversity, words that had stuck with Lopez through the years, words that had driven him to join the force, to try to be better than the men like Daniels who'd come before him. "I should have done more," Lopez added, his voice breaking slightly, his eyes dropping to the floor, the weight of his own inaction heavy on his shoulders. Marcus shook his head, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "You did enough," he said, and Lopez looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes, a spark that Marcus knew would grow, would push Lopez to keep fighting, to keep trying to change things from within. Tara pushed through the remaining spectators, her hazel eyes bright with tears as she reached Marcus, her small frame trembling with emotion as she wrapped her arms around him, hugging him tightly, her cheek pressing against his chest, the fabric of his jacket rough against her skin. "I couldn't let him get away with it," she whispered, her voice muffled against him, her words raw, carrying the weight of her own memories, of the times she'd seen her brother stopped, searched, humiliated, of the nights she'd lain awake wondering if he'd make it home. Marcus hugged her back, his arms strong, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions, his voice soft as he spoke. "You saved me," he said, and Tara pulled back, her eyes meeting his, a tear slipping down her cheek as she smiled, a small, shaky smile that spoke of healing, of connection, of a shared fight that had brought them together. She wiped her eyes, her voice steadying as she spoke, her words a quiet confession. "I've faced it too, growing up, seeing it happen to my family. I had to do something." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and pride in Tara, in Lopez, in the people who'd stood with him, who'd refused to let injustice win. The lesson was clear, etched into the air of the courtroom, into the hearts of everyone who'd witnessed this moment. Justice requires standing up to bias, requires courage, requires voices that refuse to be silenced, because no one, no matter their badge, their power, their privilege, is above accountability. Marcus felt that lesson in his bones, felt it in the way the room had shifted, in the way Daniels had fallen, in the way he himself had risen, a soldier not just on the battlefield but in the fight for what was right. Marcus's story spread through Columbus like wildfire, a spark that ignited a city weary of injustice, a city ready for change. By the next morning, local news stations were running the story on every channel, the grainy footage of the arrest playing on loop, Tara's video a haunting reminder of the night that had started it all, Marcus's courtroom revelation, a rallying cry for those who'd been silenced too long. Protests erupted outside the Columbus police station. Hundreds of people gathering under a gray sky, their signs held high, "Justice for Marcus, end racial profiling, no more bad cops." Their voices rising in a chant that echoed through the streets, a demand for reform that couldn't be ignored. The city council held an emergency meeting, pressured by the public outcry, and within days they announced new measures. Mandatory bias training for all officers, a civilian review board to oversee complaints, a promise to investigate every arrest Daniels had ever made. Daniels himself was fired that week, his badge stripped away in a quiet ceremony he didn't attend, his name added to a list of officers facing criminal charges, a rare consequence for misconduct that had gone unchecked for too long. He sat alone in his apartment, the TV flickering with news of the protests, his hands clenched into fists, his career in ashes, his arrogance replaced by a bitter regret that came too late to save him. Marcus returned to his army base the following week, his uniform crisp, his major's insignia gleaming on his shoulder, a symbol of the honor he'd fought for, the honor Daniels had tried to take from him. But the experience had changed him, lit a fire in him that wouldn't be extinguished, a determination to do more, to be more, to ensure that what had happened to him wouldn't happen to others. He started speaking at community events, his voice steady as he shared his story, his dark eyes shining with a quiet intensity that drew people in, made them listen, made them feel the weight of his words. He spoke at a local high school, the same one where Lopez had once heard him, his words echoing through the auditorium as students leaned forward, their notebooks open, their faces a mix of awe and determination, just as Lopez's had been years ago. Marcus told them about resilience, about standing up to injustice, about the power of one voice, one act, one moment to change everything. And the students clapped, their applause a thunderous wave that filled him with a pride deeper than any medal he'd ever earned. Lopez, moved by Marcus' resilience, found his own purpose in the aftermath, a clarity he'd been searching for since he'd joined the force. He began advocating for better training in his precinct, working late into the night to draft proposals, to push for change, to ensure that no officer could wield their badge like a weapon without consequence. He met with community leaders, his uniform a symbol of hope now, not fear, his voice steady as he spoke about accountability, about the need for trust between the police and the people they served. He thought of Marcus often, of the man who'd inspired him twice, once as a teenager, once as a cop, and he vowed to honor that inspiration, to be the kind of officer Marcus would be proud of, the kind of officer his community deserved. Tara, too, found her calling in the wake of the trial, her small act of courage on that rainy night blossoming into something bigger, something that would outlast her. She started a local group to document police interactions, a grassroots effort that grew quickly, dozens of volunteers joining her, their phones at the ready, their mission clear, to ensure accountability, to shine a light on the darkness, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She named the group Witness for Justice, a nod to the moment that had changed her life, the moment she'd refused to drive away, and she worked tirelessly, organizing training sessions, setting up a hotline, speaking at rallies, her hazel eyes bright with a fire that hadn't been there before. She thought of Marcus often, of the hug they'd shared in the courtroom, of the way he'd thanked her, and she felt a connection to him, a bond forged in the fight for what was right, a bond that gave her the strength to keep going, even on the hardest days. Marcus' fight became a catalyst for change, a ripple that spread far beyond Columbus, touching lives he'd never meet, inspiring stories he'd never hear. Protests continued, not just in Columbus, but in cities across the state, across the country, people taking to the streets, their voices rising, their demands clear. No more Daniels, no more bias, No more silence. The system wasn't fixed, not yet, but Marcus had cracked it open, had shown that one voice could shift the tide, could make the impossible possible, could remind the world that justice wasn't a gift, it was a fight, and it was worth fighting for. He walked through his base one evening, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, his steps firm, his purpose clear, his heart full of a quiet pride, a pride in himself, in Tara, in Lopez, in the people who'd stood with him, who'd made this victory possible. Have you ever faced unfair treatment? Marcus's voice echoed in the minds of those who'd heard his story, a question that lingered, a call to action that couldn't be ignored. Share your story below, like, subscribe, and let's demand justice together. The words were a bridge, a connection between Marcus and the world, an invitation to speak, to act, to join the fight, to ensure that his story wasn't the end but the beginning, a spark that would light the way for others, a reminder that change started with a single voice, a single act, a single moment of courage.